Hey, if you'd like to earn CEUs for this webinar, join the Safeopedia community at the link in the description below. Now, on to the show.
Hello, and a warm welcome to everyone. We would like to wish everyone a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Samantha from Safeopedia, and here at Safeopedia, it is our mission to support the EH&S professionals, operational folks, and any safety-minded individuals with free safety information, tools, and education. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to all of you, our dedicated safety professionals, for the great work you do on a daily basis in keeping all of us safe. Just a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and we will send out a link to the recording to everyone in a few days. This webinar is for you, so let's keep it interactive. Make sure you get your comments and your questions into the Zoom Q&A and we will get to them at the end of this presentation. Today, we are proud to present, Are Your JSAs Good Enough? Don't wait for a workplace incident to find out. This Safeopedia webinar has been made possible today by Velocity EH&S. Today, I'd like to introduce to you our presenter, Greg Duncan. Greg is going to explore the 5 key characteristics for strong and effective JSAs and how to help you prevent incidents and keep your workers safe. I'm very excited to have you all sit back, relax, and enjoy this presentation. With that, Greg, let's jump into it.
All right. Thank you, Samantha. Really appreciate the warm welcome, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. It looks like we've got a good crowd, so let's go ahead and get started. First things first, as always, we're going to cover our session agenda, and that includes covering some JSA basics to help us kind of get the a foundation for the remainder of the topics we'll cover, which include some best practices for helping to optimize your JSA processes. And then we're going to take a little dabble into some advanced risk assessment techniques and discuss how they can actually help you to really strengthen your JSAs, especially when we're looking at some more high hazard or complex jobs and job tasks. And then lastly, we'll offer up some takeaways and some key ways that you can improve your JSAs through the systems and tools that you use to perform them, to maintain them, and put them to work. So level set here, let's talk some job safety analysis basics. This will be a refresher for a lot of you, I think, but just to make sure everybody's kind of got a common understanding moving forward, we want to know, what is a job safety analysis? Well, it's sometimes known as job hazard analysis, so maybe you've heard of that before. It's the same thing, really. What it boils down to is the JSA is a systematic method for identifying, assessing, and controlling job task hazards and the risks associated with those. And it's really a great method. It's the preferred method for identifying and documenting and then ultimately controlling hazards when it comes to individual jobs and job tasks. And there's a lot of guidance out there. There's documents from OSHA, from CCOSH. In Canada, there's EU OSHA documents. There's every major occupational health and safety management agency around the world has published guidance around JSAs, and so the value of them hopefully is quite clear, and hopefully you're already using them, and hopefully today will help you to improve them. So there are a lot of benefits to JSAs. The biggest ones are, of course, being able to provide a standardized, formal set of safe work instructions for operators, frontline workers to be able to perform their jobs safely. It also helps, provide this standardized framework for us to establish a high level of accountability and ownership for hazard identification and control. There's, as we'll see a little bit later on, there's a lot of people and tasks and assignments that go into a complete JSA, and so being able to coordinate all of those people and all those actions is one of the greatest benefits, I think. It's also a learning exercise, and it's an opportunity to engage our workers in the occupational health and safety program. And as we'll see later on as well, it's an ideal exercise to get your workers involved in hazard identification and control. It's also a great resource. As I mentioned, it is a primary source for many employers to document safe work practices. And by doing so and communicating that throughout the organization, we're really promoting a greater understanding of safe work practices, of the hazards that exist in the workplace, and just making sure that everybody's aware of that. And it helps to promote that greater awareness of safety and hazards in the workplace. And of course, one of the ultimate goals is to prevent injuries and illnesses and incidents and other losses. So making sure that people are performing jobs and job tasks safely is, of course, ultimately going to help us to reduce the number of incidents, reduce the severity of hazards, and eliminate risks. So there's a lot of, as I mentioned, there's a lot of resources out there about how to actually perform a job safety analysis. And, some of them will have a 4-step process, and some will have as many as 7 or 8 steps in the process. And, I think that this 6-step process that I have here kind of synthesizes those variety of resources without getting too overly complex, but also being granular enough so that we're hitting all the points and kind of being distinct about which step we're at throughout that process. So we're going to go through these one by one and talk about how to perform them, tips and best practices for performing each, things that you should be considering during each step, and ultimately putting it all together into a comprehensive JSA. So here's an example of what a JSA might look like. It's often done in a tabular format with your job and job task on the left, breaking that down into individual activities, identifying the hazards within each job task or for each job task, and then doing an assessment of risk, and then risk scoring or risk calculation, and then controlled selection and assignment, mitigated or residual risk calculation, and ultimately that kind of rounds out the entire JSA process. And so we're going to talk about how to do that. Starting with job selection, that's step one. You need to target your JSA, obviously. You need to know what specific jobs and ultimately job tasks, as we'll talk about next, which jobs you are focusing on in order to perform the job safety analysis. Now, I'm saying here we want to look at jobs with the highest frequency and severity of injuries, highest potential for injury, illness, or losses. We might not necessarily know that because we haven't performed the JSA yet. Well, this is when we need to look at things like our injury and illness records, hazard reports, near miss reports, working with our JSA team and with operators and frontline workers, as we'll talk about later on. It's important to kind of do your homework and do your due diligence in order to understand, at least get a sense of where the hazards lie, where the greatest hazards lie, where the highest risk jobs are. And we need to prioritize those for the JSAs before we start to look at jobs that have lower risk that we can kind of focus on at a later point. Once we've identified which jobs we want to target for our JSA, we need to take that job and break it down into individual tasks or steps required to complete that job. Now, it's important to make sure that we're breaking the job down into concrete or discrete steps. But there's a risk of getting a little too nitpicky when it comes to breaking them down. Use your best judgment. Talk to your workers, the people who are performing these jobs, the people who have the greatest level of experience with them on a day-to-day basis, in order to help you break that down into the most logical sequence of steps. Overly or too broadly defining your job tasks, sequence of job tasks, you might miss something. You might miss a hazard associated with a discrete step in that job task or in that job. And so just making sure that you're kind of being reasonable when you're breaking that down is an important consideration at this step in the JSA. The next step is to identify the hazards of those individual job tasks. So there's a lot of questions we need to be asking here. Basically, being as thorough as we can be in order to identify all potential hazards. And again, this is going to be where your JSA team, including the workers who perform the job that's being targeted for the JSA, other people with expertise throughout the workplace are going to be valuable in helping you to really diversify your scope of what you consider to be the hazards of that job. And so making sure that you're just kind of, covering all your bases here, considering every potential hazard is really the name of the game. You can't get too granular at this point. You want to make sure that you consider every possible hazard, and as I said, you can't really go overboard at this stage. Once you've identified the hazards of each individual job task, then we need to assess the risk level of those hazards. Again, hopefully you're all familiar with the basic hazard assessment and this basic risk matrix that we see here, where we are comparing or evaluating both the risk likelihood or frequency along with the risk severity, the severity of outcomes that could come from exposure to that hazard. And then we're using those to kind of combine, multiply them crosswise, and come up with either a qualitative or semi-qualitative risk score, high, medium, low, however many dimensions of that semi-qualitative analysis or semi-quantitative analysis, I should say, you want to get, whether it's 5 levels on each axis, 7. As we'll see, there's a lot of different things that you can do to refine your risk calculations or your risk scoring to make it more representative of the true risk level rather than simply saying high, medium, or low. And that's what we're seeing here. These are different variables that we can include in our assessment of risk severity and risk likelihood. In addition to the high, medium, low, the sort of Likert scale that you would use to describe the severity and the likelihood, we can also kind of support that assessment by considering things like the number of people impacted or the frequency of exposures. And these are more at least semi-quantitative, and in some cases, we're actually able to use quantitative data, such as maybe some of our incident and injury and illness rates, in order to calculate, for example, the likelihood or frequency of a hazard being encountered. And so be thinking about ways as you begin your risk assessment to try and refine that, get a little bit finer picture, more accurate picture of your overall risk score, and use the data that you have within your occupational health and safety management system, like your injury and illness rates, hazard reports, near miss reports, and others to better assess the risks. Once we are able to come up with that risk score, then we need to start thinking about what controls will be effective in order to reduce and or potentially, ideally, eliminate that risk and effectively control that hazard. So hopefully you're all familiar with the NIOSH hierarchy of controls. The basic gist here is that the most effective controls are the controls that eliminate or remove the hazard from the job task or from the job. Um, and from there, we can then begin to consider things like substitution, engineering controls, administrative controls, and finally PPE in that order, because as we move from substitution, engineering, administrative to PPE, controls really are less and less effective. I like to think of it as the layer of protection getting thinner and thinner, and that layer of protection being closer and closer from the hazard to the worker, with PPE being the thinnest layer of protection that you can think of in protecting workers from hazards. And we don't want to stop at one. Just because we've chosen a really suitable hazard elimination or elimination type control, it doesn't mean we've completely controlled that hazard or reduced that risk to the greatest extent that's possible. The Swiss cheese model is another familiar health and safety concept, and it really goes back to this layers of protection, a concept of layers of protection, where we're putting as many barriers between the worker and the hazard as possible. Or as feasible. And this is just going to multiply. It's sort of a force multiplier in being able to protect workers from those hazards or exposure to those hazards. And we can kind of see this all play out within the JSA in this column where we have our controls listed. So we've gone through, we've identified our job tasks, done a risk assessment of the hazards of each hazard for that job task, and then we can start planning and selecting our hazard controls, and we'll list those here. And one of the things that I wanted to mention before we move on is that once you've selected and implemented appropriate controls, we need to do a follow-up risk assessment or residual risk assessment, sometimes called as a mitigated risk assessment, whatever you want to call it. Basically, what it is just verifying that after you've implemented those controls, what is the level of risk now? After we've put the things in place to protect workers and minimize the hazards, how effective are those controls? And that would be our residual risk level. Now, we can't always know that because, if we implement a control, sometimes it takes time, 6 months or a year, to really kind of prove out the effectiveness of certain controls, especially if you're not seeing incidents or near misses reported with regard to that job. And so that's where it comes time to review our JSAs. And this is the final step in the JSA process, where we are revisiting our JSA to make sure that, in essence, that they are accurate and effective. We should be reviewing our JSAs at least annually, and you should really be doing it more frequently. For higher risk jobs, you should be doing it as job hazards may change, and if new processes, materials, equipment, workers are introduced to a job, that's the perfect time to reevaluate your JSA and make sure that it is comprehensive, accurate, and that the controls you've laid out, prescribed in your JSA are effective. Now, when it comes time to make changes to your JSA and update them, perhaps because of these emergent hazards that you are newly identified, you want to make sure that you are implementing or applying management of change principles during that update process. Anytime that you make changes to safe work practices, you are potentially introducing new risk by, for example, if the right people are not involved with planning and implementing those changes and updating the JSA. If the right people are not involved in approving new controls or altered controls, modified controls, basically you're creating gaps in the communications process to update your JSAs and implement new controls. And so making sure that everybody that needs to be involved and have visibility at the right times throughout that process, and approvals where they should be approving changes. That's what management of change is all about. And it's really just sort of an exercise in governance and oversight of your JSAs. Again, making sure that you are reviewing your near miss hazard IDs, incident reports, to account for any upward or downward trends in incidents or injuries and illnesses that may have occurred after you last updated your JSA. In a ideal situation, ideal scenario, you're going to see a reduction in hazards, near misses, JSAs, or not JSAs, near misses, hazards, and incidents as a result of performing the JSA the first time. If you're not seeing some sort of a positive trend or positive reductions, you might want to ask yourself, well, why wasn't the JSA effective? Did we miss something, right? And this is where reviewing that data, including your incident records, incident investigations, we should be asking things like, were all the hazards identified? Were the corresponding controls identified? Were those controls implemented? Were they effective? And did we perform a follow-up risk assessment or residual risk assessment in order to confirm that those controls were performing as expected, or at least that they were effective? And this is all kind of plugs into the continuous improvement concept, the plan, do, check, act cycle that is really central to virtually all management system standards. Standards like ISO 45001, Occupational Health and Safety Management System standard, where we are always learning from what we've done. Every time we review our JSAs, we should be asking at its basis level, what went wrong? What did we do well? And how can we be better? How can the JSA be more effective, be better at the central goal of communicating safe work practices and protecting workers? So it's kind of a nice time to point out why JSAs are so important. We've gone through the JSA process, and I'm sure a lot of you perform JSAs in the workplace, but it's really, it's a lot of work to do. It's a lot of work, especially if we do them, righteously, and we do them in the most thorough and diligent way that we should be. We want to make sure that we're able to justify our efforts, right? Well, it's because JSAs contribute to, or have at least a partial contribution to, a huge percentage of incidents in the workplace. A couple colleagues of mine, Mark Jouer and Dana Garber, both with Velocity EH&S, actually published a research paper last year, I believe it was, possibly 2023, in the AIHA journal, and did an analysis of some Chemical Safety Board investigation reports. Basically, they looked at 46 incident investigation reports between 2010 and 2021. And, there's a lot of stats and figures here. The big one that I want to call out is hazard analysis. 71% of the incidents that they looked at in the investigations that they studied, 71% of them, hazard analysis or failures in hazard analysis was found to be a contributing factor. And what are JSAs for? They're for assessing those hazards. So there's clearly gaps. Employers are unfortunately experiencing gaps in their JSAs. There's a lot of other contributing factors, but if we can strengthen and shore up our JSAs, we can at least check this one off the list and take confidence that our JSAs are not being a contributing factor to potential injuries and illnesses in the workplace. There was one interesting case study that I looked at. This comes from the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, which, if you folks aren't familiar, is essentially the OSHA for offshore oil and gas and energy production. And they had a particular incident where they looked at failures in the JSA. On a offshore rig, a crew was preparing to perform a replacement in kind of some sort of process component. I believe it was some sort of a pipe fitting or valve, and they had done this many times before, and so the attitude was, this is a replacement in kind, nothing's different. We can just do it. When they went to go do it, they realized they had to remove a section of the walkway and the railing in order to remove the part completely and get the new part in. Well, they didn't account for that removal of walkway section in the JSA. And while they were doing it, they were hoisting that segment of the walkway with a crane or some sort of a hoist. And it was not properly loaded, and it ended up swinging. Once it was freed, it ended up swinging and actually hit a worker and caused severe injuries to that worker. And the Bessie investigation revealed that it was this lack of accounting for this removal of section in the walkway during performance of what was essentially a routine task that was the primary cause of the accident. And so it could have been much worse. There could have been damage to the piping systems that were on the rig, and it could have amounted to a much larger incident. Um, and there's a lot of other ways that our JSAs can go wrong. I found an interesting study that was in the National Institutes of Health. This is a study that was done back in 2023, and it looked at 49 journal articles related to job safety analysis practices and incidents involving job safety analysis failures. And of these 49 different articles, they found a number of common JSA failures. And so these are things that we should be on the lookout for when we're looking at and asking how effective are our JSAs. How do we make sure that they're not contributing to potential incidents? So they found that one, a lack of employee or stakeholder participation when performing the JSAs was a key factor. Um, Failure to apply that hierarchy of controls and to evaluate residual risk. And that's, one of the reasons why I made sure I tried to call that out, that residual risk analysis or follow-up risk analysis or risk assessment, and why that's so important. Another one that's interesting and that doesn't get thought about a lot is failure to consider work hazard interactions. This is where a hazard performed during perhaps one step or one task of the job sequence can create hazards for subsequent steps. And this also refers to hazards that may be introduced as a result of another job being performed in the vicinity of the job that we're looking at within our JSA that we're targeting right now. Maybe a worker performing their job on a machine close by could create hazards for this. And so failure to account for that is another reason why JSAs are often lacking. A big one here is the lack of a unified framework for risk assessment and inconsistent risk assessment techniques. Not to dive too far into things, but hopefully you've all heard of the concept of risk perception and how one risk may seem, more severe, more or less severe for one person than another. And so when we have multiple individuals performing JSAs across the workplace, even on the same job, essentially, there can be differences in how that risk is evaluated. And so, as we'll see a little bit later on, it's really important to develop a standardized system and to develop a common understanding and perception of risk in order to reduce that variability from one risk assessment to the next. Some additional common JSA failures, they found that a lack of initial or comprehensive understanding of hazards was what is actually contributing to hazards going unrecognized within the JSAs. Sounds pretty obvious, right? But again, it goes back to what I was saying you really can't be too you really can't go overboard when you are looking at and assessing the hazards of each job task. Being as wide of a lens as possible, or taking as wide of a lens as possible when you're looking at those hazards, considering what the hazards of a job are, is going to help us to eliminate that and making sure that you capture those hazards. It's one thing to say this could happen, and it's another thing to actually document it and then assess the risk of that hazard. Another interesting one that I thought that they pointed out in this study was the failure to consider recovery measures. So let's say that there is some sort of um, issue with the job process. Something goes wrong, machine breaks down, or there's an error with some process. What is needed to get that job back running in the sequence that is intended or anticipated, and what are the hazards of the steps required to do so? Your job safety analysis should also consider, these sort of non-routine or unexpected types of tasks that might be required in such a scenario. And then also, if this kind of goes hand in hand with that, failure to identify hazards that are created or introduced by performing job tasks out of the predefined sequence. And so, I can't think of a scenario off the top of my head where that might be the case, but things change, stuff happens, and we might need to alter that prescribed job task sequence. And what are the hazards of doing so? Making sure that we consider that in our JSAs. And the last couple here point more towards the systems that we're using to communicate, to document, and then to communicate our JSAs. They found that an inability to share and compare JSA findings across work sites or facilities was a big failure and contributed to incidents in the studies that they looked at. And you can imagine why that would be. We've already talked about how JSAs are a primary way of communicating safe work practices to operators and frontline workers. And if you're not able to easily share and communicate that information and put it in front of workers so that they can follow it, you're really losing the whole point of a JSA. And then lastly, tedious, time-consuming to perform the JSAs was actually the most frequent drawback or JSA failure mentioned in these studies that they looked at. And so we already did kind of talk about how it can seem like a lot of work to perform a JSA and do it really well, and to make sure that we are capturing every job task, every hazard of each job task, performing a meaningful risk assessment of each of those hazards. It's already starting to pile up, right? And so making sure that we have some system in place to help us simplify that process, structure that process, and make it easier to do is really going to contribute to a more thorough and accurate JSA. Okay, so now that we've seen how things can go wrong, how do we make sure that they don't, how do we avoid these failures? And so some of the things that we will point out here are what I believe to be some JSA best practices. And they're actually really simple things that you can do today, start doing today in order to help improve your JSAs. Make sure that you're focusing on your JSA team. Unfortunately, I think in a lot of scenarios, it'll be a health and safety manager or maybe a supervisor who's going around and doing the JSA single-handedly, all by themselves. That's not the right way to do it. You need to include a variety of perspectives and a variety of different people of different experiences and roles in order to do job safety analysis truly well. Yes, of course, people from your safety team need to be involved, but you should also get the workers who are performing those jobs. I mean, it sounds like it's really obvious, right? But it doesn't, it gets overlooked more often than you would think. And then employees, people from other departments that have some related experience or who are affected by that job. For example, maintenance personnel, engineers, um, uh, production, operations, procurement, like all these folks may have something to contribute to your JSA. And so assessing who should be on that JSA team is honestly, that you should be doing that before you're ever looking at jobs to perform or target for job safety analysis. It's kind of I equate it to a sort of a stakeholder materiality assessment in some ways, finding out who has a stake in safety of this job, which in many cases is everyone, but making sure that you're getting the people in who have something to contribute to that process and getting them into that conversation early. By doing so, you're going to achieve a lot of benefits of the JSA that we already pointed out a little bit earlier on. It drives that employee engagement. It gets them involved and encourages a sense of ownership and responsibility and accountability for the safety of the workplace. Of course, it almost goes without saying that having that diverse background of experiences and roles is going to help you to be more comprehensive and achieve a wider scope of identifying hazards and performing more accurate risk assessments and identifying the right controls when it comes time to do so. it's just going to really bolster your job safety analysis, make it as effective as possible. And all of these things together help to under support a stronger safety culture, making sure that your job safety analysis team is they're sort of the living, breathing example and most visible example to workers and people throughout the workplace that the organization, that your business is committed to safety, that they're out there, they're on patrol, they're looking for hazards, they're actively controlling them and trying to make every job safer for everybody. And you can imagine how that would really strengthen the workplace safety culture. The next best practice I want to recommend is to make sure that you are bringing your JSAs to life, doing, getting the greatest value out of them that you can. I think it's an unfortunate case that a lot of people will perform the job safety analysis because maybe it's they use it to meet a specific hazard identification and control requirement in some regulation, or they do it because it's just kind of that's the way things were always done. But it's not just it's not going through the motions. It's not just checking a box. A job safety analysis offers so many benefits, and we can only achieve those benefits if we are utilizing them to their fullest potential. Making sure that when we uncover hazards and when we implement controls to control those hazards, that the job safety analysis allows us to be responsive to the changing conditions or changing risks in the workplace. Risks change frequently. As I mentioned before, anytime you have new hazards identified in the work or introduced into the workplace, new materials, new people hired on. The JSA is kind of a checkpoint to allow you to ensure that safe work practices are set and that everybody's following those safe work practices before you move forward, before you introduce a new operator to a workstation. There's just a lot of benefits that the JSA will help you to achieve. And you also want to make sure that you are incorporating these hazards and controls that you're identifying through your JSAs into other areas. I spoke at a conference last year, and I ran into an attendee at my session where I was presenting this topic, and they showed me an interesting way that they were using JSAs. They were essentially taking the Excel sheet or whatever they were, had in order to document their JSAs, printing them out, laminating them, and then posting them at every workstation. And so it was essentially a manual for how to perform, how to use that particular piece of equipment, how to perform that specific job safely. And I thought that was really great. It was really encouraging to see that somebody out there, and hopefully a lot of you are doing this, was actually putting the JSA to work, communicating it to the workers who are doing those jobs, and putting it right in front of their face, making it highly visible. Other areas where you can do this, where you can take your JSAs and really put them to work, would be things like safe work practices on your permit to work. As a lot of you are probably aware, when you have something like a permit required confined space permit or other type of permit to work, you have to include the relevant hazards of that job and safe work practices to be able to work safely, to perform that permitted job safely. The JSA is the perfect way to do that. Just taking your JSA and porting it right into the permit is a really easy way to provide those safe work instructions. And lastly, make sure that you're always referring to your JSAs when you are working within, let's say, your safety committees to develop corrective actions or workplace health and safety improvements. The JSA is a really great resource to be able to identify where improvements can be made, where existing risks lie. And so keeping that document front and center whenever you're talking about safety in the workplace is always a good idea. Just to reiterate overall, making sure that we are using our JSAs to their fullest potential and not just filing them away in a drawer somewhere. And one area where, or one aspect where we can really put our JSAs to work that I think is worth calling out here is in training. Your JSA is an excellent training resource. As I mentioned before, it is essentially instructions for safe work. And you can imagine why that would be an excellent training resource to have on hand. But there's also the JSA helps to drive the training program. As you're identifying new hazards, implementing new controls, that is going to be valuable to have your JSA to look at when you are thinking, all right, well, now we've got this new process that we're getting up and running in the workplace. What do we need to train on to ensure that everybody is aware of how to perform the work safely, how to operate it properly, how to identify hazards related to that piece of equipment or related to that process. The JSA is really valuable for being able to point that out and should always be considered when you're developing your training needs and training requirements. And it's a really good way to align worker roles, the people that are performing those jobs for which we have our job safety analysis. What training do they require? And the job safety analysis is a great way to identify that. And then, I had mentioned that, most JSAs are done in this tabular format, like a spreadsheet, and it's really the best way to lay them out. It's a really nice, easy visual way to document each step in the process, in a sequential fashion, and be able to put that information there, line item by line item, task, hazard, controls, right? But if you're using spreadsheets to actually perform and document and communicate your JSAs, there's a lot of areas where, a lot of those common JSA failures that we looked at earlier, where those can crop up. When we talked about poor communication of JSAs as being one of those big, more common failures. It's really difficult to communicate those JSAs within a spreadsheet. There's a lot of document control issues and am I looking at the most up-to-date JSA? It can be hard to determine that. Also, a spreadsheet doesn't really offer anything in terms of corrective action or control implementation, assignment and tracking. Let's say you've selected a specific control for a recognized hazard. You can put that into the base controls column in your JSA, but then how do you ensure that it's actually been put into place, that the right people are notified that they need to implement that control, that we're notified once it has been implemented, and that we're able to ensure that it is indeed effective. It can be difficult to perform our risk calculation, our risk scoring, especially as the more variables we use to calculate that risk score, variables related to risk likelihood or frequency and risk severity. The more complex we make that calculation, the more difficult it can be to set that up within an Excel sheet. Also, when it comes to maintaining a list or master list of hazards and control libraries, one of those key failures or most common failures that we pointed out from that NIH study was a lack of sort of a master hazard library. And the only way you can really do that in an Excel file is to build out this massive drop-down list, and that needs to be updated every time, right? Well, if you have some sort of a system that's kind of constantly logging every hazard as it is entered into any and all of your JSAs, and then making that database or that knowledge base of hazards and controls accessible in every other subsequent JSA that you perform, so that you can just kind of select from known hazards and known proven controls. That makes things a lot easier. And then also, again, getting back to that notion of standardization of your risk assessment methods and criteria. There's not a lot of way to standardize what variables and how workers categorize and how they classify risk, likelihood, and severity. And so having some sort of a system that helps to apply that standard set of criteria is ideal. Okay, let's take a look at some advanced risk assessment techniques. We'll zip through these because they're kind of high level. They're really more for more high risk and more complex jobs and job tasks. And when we get to a certain level of complexity, we're no longer looking at JSAs. We're actually looking at more complex risk assessment methodologies like HAZOPs and other things. But we'll take a quick look at that and just see how they can help augment our JSAs and how they can help support them. So ultimately, when we're performing a JSA and we're looking at the risks and we're trying to find out what is the source of those risks, what is the source of those hazards, and what is the most effective and ideal control to address the root causes of those hazards, we're looking at a number of different techniques that we can use to identify those root causes and then ultimately document them in order to assign the most appropriate controls. And so we've got more simple methods like the 5 whys or what if analysis. But as we get more complex, or as the situation demands, we need a more complex root cause analysis methodology. And then we are starting to look at things like fault and event tree analysis and bow tie analysis. And these can all help to support your JSAs, and conversely, your JSAs can help to support them. So let's take a look at how. One example here is like the fault tree analysis and event tree analysis. And I like to think of these as the before and after of risks. If we look at the diagram on the left with the top event, the overheating of the motor being the sort of the risk event, the top event. Hopefully that's a term you folks are familiar with. And then working down from there to understand and identify the causes of why that top event would occur. And working our way down until we reach an appropriate level of granularity where we've identified the root causes, the true root causes of that top event occurring. Now, if we look on the left or the right side, we've got our event tree analysis, where we're looking at what are the consequences of that top event occurring. And in this case, we see that's cooling system failure. What are the consequences of that happening? And there are oftentimes many. And so the event tree analysis looks at each one of those potential consequences or effects, and then assigns a probability to that, or at the very least evaluates the severity and the likelihood of those outcomes. And along the way, we're ideally putting controls in place to control that probability, minimize the severity. And so we can see on the left side the root causes that can create or contribute to a top event, and then on the right side, the consequences of that top event occurring. And if we combine them, we actually have what is known as a bow tie analysis. And I think this is a really kind of a really mature way to look at risk causes, risk consequences, and the controls that we should be putting in place to prevent, and then if that event occurs, ultimately to mitigate them and prevent an event from being more severe. And so it's a really helpful way to look at the fault tree and event tree analysis combined into this bow tie analysis as a single picture of risk. How are these events happening? what can we do to prevent them? And if they happen, what can we do to mitigate the consequences? And one of the greatest benefits, I think, of this is that Bowtie helps us to get out of the habit of looking at risk causes and consequences as this sort of linear pathway. A lot of times when we look at risks and we have risk registers, we're looking at line items and we're thinking, okay, this root cause can contribute to this event, and we put this control in place, and we can minimize the risk to this residual risk level here. But a lot of times these causes can interact as well as controls. The effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of a particular control can contribute to the likelihood of one or more consequences. Sometimes these root causes can act synergistically and make it more likely that if they're both present, that the likelihood of a particular event or a particular consequence is that much greater. So the bow tie essentially helps us to visualize these interactions between causes and consequences. So what does this have to do with JSAs? Well, if we look at the controls that we've got here between our, if we look at the bow tie diagram on the left, and we've got our causes on the left and our consequences on the far right, and in between, we've got preventive and mitigative controls. Well, those controls are ideally being plugged into your controls column within your JSA. So if you are using a bow tie analysis in order to document these risks, you can take those controls directly from the bow tie, put them into your JSA, and then you've got this kind of synced up a syncing between your JSAs and your bow tie analysis or other risk management tools in order to create this consistency and the sort of one-to-one alignment between the two. All right, so we're getting close to the top of the hour here. Let's go through some takeaways and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions. Just want to reiterate, the job safety analysis is really a very, very valuable tool for identifying, controlling, and ultimately communicating risks within the workplace. And it's a great format. It's like a multi-tool for communicating that information and establishing safe work practices, providing a format for and a location for documenting all the information that you have, your jobs, job tasks, your unique hazards, the risks of those hazards, and the controls assigned for each. I also want to remind everybody that JSAs shouldn't just be a one and done kind of a thing. We should view them as a living document that has important or makes important contributions to other aspects of our occupational health and safety programs. For example, the permit to safe work instructions on your permit to work. I can't stress it enough that making sure that you are working with your JSA team, building your JSA team, getting everybody engaged, getting everybody involved, including top-down support from management as well as bottom-up engagement from frontline workers is really key to ensuring your JSAs are accurate, comprehensive, and being used to the greatest extent possible. We looked at a lot of different JSA related failures that contributed to events from some of those academic studies that we looked at. And many of those failures are related to the systems that folks are using to capture and document and then communicate their job safety analysis. And so we should always be revisiting and rethinking the systems that we're using for doing that, for performing our JSAs. And thinking what tools are available out there to help us improve rather than kind of just always falling back on spreadsheets or paper documents, which lack the functionality and the capabilities that you need to really put them to work the way that they deserve. Last thing I want to note, or a couple last things I want to note, making sure that you are establishing firm understanding of risk, of the risks in your workplace so that everybody is kind of operating from the same perspective when it comes to evaluating that risk. likelihood, severity, and ultimately the risk scores, because then you can have this apples to apples comparison of one JSA to another, and that's going to enable you to better prioritize jobs for improvements and for controls. It's also going to help you, better understand the impact of those JSAs on other indicators within your health and safety program. How are your JSAs impacting your incident rates or training completion? Whatever indicators you want, you still need to have this sort of standardized starting point in order to be able to make those comparisons. And lastly, if you're not using JSAs, or if you're not doing them or using them to their full potential, you're really leaving yourself open to this to risk, and you're ultimately assuming a kind of a reactive stance to workplace health and safety. If you're keeping your JSAs updated, if you're using them to communicate safe work practices, if you're using them to train your workers, if you're really putting them to work and you're keeping on top of them, keeping them updated, that naturally introduces the concept of continuous improvement to your health and safety program. And that's going to keep you on the front foot when it comes to managing health and safety and preventing workplace incidents. And this all fits into this notion, this continuous improvement philosophy. It all fits into this notion of health and safety program maturity, or risk maturity model that we like to show folks. When we're kind of on the lower end here, we're in that more reactive state. Unfortunately, we're not putting our JSAs to their full use, using them to their fullest potential. But as we begin to do these things, as we begin to, update them more frequently and use them and apply them in different areas of our health and safety programs, we begin to achieve a more preventive stance. And then this kind of leads us, through continuous improvement on up the scale until we are, being well ahead of the curve, and being, highly proactive, and actually being thought leaders when it comes to health and safety. And a big contributor to that is to what degree and how effective our JSAs are. Okay, so that's pretty much it for today. I just want to recommend to all folks that they check out Velocity EH&S operational risk software. Our operational risk software does include a very versatile, very advanced JSA capability, along with other risk management tools, including bow tie analysis, to help you get a better handle on the risks in your workplace and make sure that you're communicating that more effectively to everybody throughout your organization. So definitely recommend checking that out. And at this time, I'd like to hand it back over to Samantha in case we have any questions.
Perfect. Greg, that was a ton of information. I encourage
Yeah.
everyone to scan that QR code. I also put a link in the chat. Make sure you click on that. If you need any other resources or you'd like to connect with the team, make sure that you reach out. A couple of questions here, or the main question would be, could you direct us to some resources to give us a good example of what you would consider a good JSA?
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of sounding self-serving, we've got some videos. This video that I'm linking to the QR code here will show you how our system performs the JSAs. Additional resources I had mentioned that are out there. OSHA has a complete guide. It's like a 33-page document on how to. It's a bit overkill, but it's a pretty comprehensive guide on how to perform a job safety analysis. I know that the Canadian Center for Occupational Health and Safety, CCOS, they have a similar resource as well. And there's a lot of actual universities out there. Some of the resources that I looked at were from universities that have developed their own JSA process. And so really what I've tried to do with this presentation is to synthesize a lot of that for you. But you're more than welcome to check out and see what the agencies like OSHA or organizations like SECOS or some of these universities have to offer on how to manage your JSAs. There's a lot of resources out there. There truly are.
Fantastic. Now, I want to make sure that we get everybody settled in here. So, Greg, is there anything that you want our audience to take away from today? You want them to keep top of mind so that they can be successful?
It's something that I already said, and I really can't stress enough. It is JSAs are tailor-made for hazard identification and control. It's really the ideal method to do so and to document what you're doing to do that, because so much of occupational health and safety is about hazard identification and control, hazard awareness, and hazard control. And the JSA is a really valuable tool for communicating those risks throughout the workplace and for documenting what you're doing to make the workplace safer. The trick is that your JSA, um, there's a lot that goes into it, and if you're just using like some sort of a paper form, you're just kind of missing out on all the capabilities that are out there, and especially when it comes to um, doing assignments, control planning, control assignments, corrective action assignments, follow-ups on that, status notifications, like all the functionality that you need to actually put your JSAs to work. It's just either really not possible or very hard to manage if you're leaning on a paper-based system or even a spreadsheet-based system. And I'm sure everybody out here knows that if they're using those types of systems, and maybe they're not seeing as much value from their JSAs as they would like. And I think that when you're not seeing that value, it kind of lends us to it's kind of not uh, keeping up with them as much as we should, not using them to the greatest extent possible, because we can't. Um, and the last thing I'll say is just make sure that you're reviewing them regularly. If you could do one thing, go crack open your JSA and review it, when you can. If you can do it today, great. If not, soon. And just kind of see some of the things, look at it through a new lens, based on some of the things that we've discussed today, and see how you can, maybe put one or two things that you've learned today into practice. Start small. Don't try to eat the whole apple in one bite. Take what you've learned and see where you can apply it, and you'll be on the right track.
Fantastic. Well, Greg, I'm sure we could be here all day talking about this, but I want to give some people back their time. And make sure that you check out the links, scan that QR code. Like I said, we will send out a copy of this presentation to everyone in a few days. Greg, I want to give you a huge thank you. Thank you for bringing us back to basics while also elevating us to the future. I think you hit on a really good point there. Crack open your JSAs. If not today, sometime this week, sometime in the near future, and really get a new perspective on it. So Greg, thank you again. Thank you to Velocity EH&S for allowing us to put this on today. And of course, all of our dedicated safety professionals in the audience, because without you guys, none of this would be possible. So thanks again. Take care, stay safe, and have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
That's right. Thank you.